Welcome all to our third program in our Rev 250 speaker series. I'm Elizabeth Tatum. I'm the director of Historic Red Hook. And I just want to thank you a few people before we start our program. If you are a current trustee of Historic Red Hook, please wave your hand. Thank you all for being here and for helping out. We have a working board. They do so much to make all of our programs run. If you are a current or a past volunteer, please raise your hand. Oh, the volume needs to go up in the other room? Okay, thank you. I'll be there momentarily. Okay, so thank you all for coming. This speaker series was made possible by Dutchess County and their grant program for celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, which we kicked off back in April of 2025. So we've been really thankful to have so many amazing speakers come here for this program. We're very excited to have a Red Hook alum joining us for this program in particular to speak to the local particulars of this event. Before we get into that program, I just want to do a few announcements. Let me see if I can there we go. So we do have two more remaining programs in this series. We have Hadrian Kumans coming on October 18th from the Lenape Center to speak about Lenape perspectives on the American Revolution. And then on November 22nd, we have Kirsten E. Wood speaking about accommodating the Republic, how taverns encourage travel, innovations, and civic engagement in the new United States. She's coming all the way from Florida to talk about her book, so that'll be really great. And Oblong Books is going to be selling her book as well. So if you're interested in these events, the registration for the Hadrian Kumans events is going on now. And I will notify this audience via email when registration goes up for the second event. As you can see, these events fill up really quickly, so make sure you keep an eye out for that email. We have a lot of other events happening as well. Next week is our annual meeting. So if you're a current Historic Red Hook member, you can join us for a sit-down meal just to enjoy community and also hear about what we're working on behind the scenes. And if you're not a member and you'd like to join, it's very simple to just join online. Individual memberships start at $25 a year. On October 11th, which is next Saturday, we have Hudson River Heritage joining us. They're having a restoration and preservation artisans and their craft in the Hudson Valley. Essentially, lots of restoration and preservation experts will be here in the Elmendorf talking about historic buildings and historic trades. So be sure to check that out. It's part of their large overarching tour of the Hudson Valley. So they do have tickets if you're interested in that event, and you can find that on our website. On October 22nd, we have our historic Tavern Trail at Foster's Coach House. I do believe that event is completely booked. It's become very popular. So you can keep your eye out for that. Put your name on a wait list if you'd like to attend. And then on October 27th, we have the conclusion of our Cemetery Crawl award ceremony. The cemetery crawl is currently ongoing. You can go to 6 different cemeteries and read the biographies of over 100 different departed Red Hook residents. And then you can also compete in a scavenger hunt if you're a competitive sort of person. It all concludes on October 27th. You can be here for special prizes, and it's a lot of fun. And then finally, our online benefit auction kicks off on November 1st. It goes until the 16th of November, and this is really one of our biggest fundraisers of the year. There's always a lot of special offerings in it, from tours of private historic homes to staying at private historic homes as well. Lots of fun, so please keep your eye out on that. So just a quick note about supporting Historic Red Hook. I'm really grateful to all of you who came here today, and many of you made donations online, which we really appreciate it. It helps make these programs run. Free programming here is really made possible by your donations, by others volunteering their time, and also by those who become a member. You can find out all about that on our website at the various URLs that I've listed below. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dillon Streifeneder. Dillon is a historian of colonial America and the American Revolution and the early American Republic. His current project focuses on state formation and governance in New York during the era of the American Revolution. Streifeneder received his PhD from the Ohio State University, and he is currently an assistant professor of history at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Okay, I'm going to pass this over to Dillon. I'm going to make sure that his slides come up so that he's all set before I leave. Okay. Okay, you should begin.
Okay.
And just make sure you're on this side of all the wires.
You want me to wait for a second?
Yeah, I'm gonna check to make sure you're all set.
Okay. Well, good afternoon or evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Elizabeth, for bringing me in and welcoming me to be part of your speaker series. It's great to be back in Red Hook. Grew up here, so nice to be back. What else do I need to say before I begin? Anything that I say is not representative of the United States Navy or Department of Defense. I think that's like a requirement that I have to say. My thoughts are my own with that. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about Red Hook, Rhinebeck, and the American Revolution. Okay, so in 1815, John Adams queried Thomas Jefferson, quote, "What do we mean by the revolution?" He continued, "The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775. Now, for a long time, Adams's assertion held a strong influence on how we understood the American Revolution. But in the last few decades, his sentiment has given way to a more nuanced understanding. Now, I think for starters, war often has a major impact on society. So for those who have lived through the Vietnam era, think of the impact that the war had on American society. We should think about the revolution in the same way. Between 1775 and 1783, a drastic change occurred for those living in what became the United States when American Revolution transitioned to Revolutionary War. The war thoroughly changed the dynamics of resistance to Great Britain. It placed additional demands on each level of the public to respond in a range of ways, whether that was through military service, whether that was through economic boycotts, whether that was through ostracizing one's neighbors who refused to conform to the Patriot movement. Most of all, the war brought with it new and tremendous tensions. Wartime exigency forced the newly emerging state governments and the union of 13 states that eventually became the United States to take dramatic steps to secure independence. Actions that may have been equated with tyranny or oppression of freedoms and liberties became common. Those were the reasons, right, that the colonies rebelled in the first place from Great Britain. Whether for or against the revolutionary movement, or if you try to stay neutral and avoid the whole thing altogether, wartime exigencies forced people to pick a side even if you didn't want to and you simply wanted to sit out. Now, the government's efforts to secure independence and everything they had to do were often unpopular. They enacted simultaneously a series of changes that swept through society that also altered the trajectory of the revolutionary movement. Put simply, independence without a war would have resulted in a very different United States. So my focus tonight is on the 8 years of war. In particular, I'm going to I sort of frame this around two questions. The first one is, what was it like to live through a revolution? The American Revolution was one that became of many that became sort of tied into the age of revolutions. And then second, what did the everyday experience of living through revolution look like here in Red Hook and Rhinebeck? Now, before I sort of get into the meat of things, I just want to put this up on so we're all on the same page. So thinking about a revolution, how are we defining a revolution? I throw this up here in part because if we think we have a lot of revolutions, whether it's the Industrial Revolution, whether it's going back the Market Revolution, you can just start naming off revolutions. There's an agricultural revolution. There's like revolutions for everything. I'm referring in particular to a political revolution. And I think Jack Goldstone, he has a tiny little book out in like the Oxford Short History series. I think his sort of overview gives us a good baseline. So we're all on the same page. What I'm referring to is a forcible overthrow of government. And it requires mass mobilization to create new political institutions. Now, I think we can add into that also that the changes to government can also bring about other changes, especially when we're thinking about social structures, thinking about authority, thinking about economics, all of that. Revolutions can impact all of that. All right, so we got that baseline down. So how do we make revolution happen? Just sort of taking for granted up to 1775. I'm sort of starting around 1775 tonight. So, right, okay, American colonists are annoyed with Great Britain. That's its own complex thing. But how do you make revolution happen? And I would say that the engine for revolution are local committees of safety. Now, the committees, they're extra legal. They have no authority. They're basically like a local board of people. So each district or precinct or town is going to have a committee. The committee is just common people. They're popularly elected by their neighbors, and initially they're supposed to pass along information. So they're supposed to pass information from newspapers. They're supposed to pass along information acquired through letters. They're supposed to pass along information that they gather at the local inn or tavern. So these individuals come together and they're passing along information. Now that's going to transition eventually into taking action to enforce policies. And so I throw this up here that a number of historians have referred to them as schools of revolution. In many ways, they would hold meetings and they would read to the public various actions that were being taken either in Britain's parliament or locally. Now, in many ways, that is sort of a school type setting. They're educating, they're putting verse pamphlet, talking through why one is, better than the other. And that's one side of the thing. But as we start to transition from this sort of revolution into a war, especially after Lexington and conquered, the committees are going to become a group that uses force, that uses violence. And so if you're a loyalist, in many ways, I think you could think about them as similar to like the Viet Cong or Al-Qaeda. They have been described as a terrorist organization. And especially if you're a loyalist living in Rhinebeck at the time, they are a group who is going to watch you and suppress your freedom of speech, your freedom of the press, your freedom of assembly, your right to bear arms. They're going to do all of that during this period. So this group is going to be instrumental in sort of acting as the engine of getting people on board. One of the ways they do that is the association I have up here in the corner. So how do you determine if someone is like in favor of the revolution or not in favor of the revolution? Well, they send people around door to door, knock on your door, and ask you, are you willing to sign this document that says you're going to boycott tea? There's also a series of ridiculous things in the association, like stop participating in cockfights and horse racing. So it's like it's a laundry list of what you should and shouldn't be doing. The bigger point, though, is that if you signed it, your name gets published and printed in the newspaper. If you didn't sign it, you also get published and printed in the newspaper under a separate list of so-and-so refused to sign this. Now, that's going to have consequences because as time goes on, people are going to start ostracizing you. People are going to stop doing business with you. It can ruin you financially. You can be shunned from a community that you used to be part of simply because you refused to sign this document that you didn't know that much about. So it becomes a powerful engine again for making revolution happen. Now, crucial to this is information, right? So the committees start out as committees of communication. And so I have it up here. So William Smith Jr., you're going to see him a lot. He appears throughout. So William Smith Jr., he is on the council in the colonial period. There's a council that advises the royal governor. He lives in New York City. He's sort of this remarkable character in the fact that he gets put under house arrest in Livingston Manor. And so he's going to be there during the revolution. He does not support the revolution, but he's under house arrest and he's just sitting there with a lot of time. And he's highly articulate. And so he's going to write, and he has a journal that's like this fat about his day-to-day happenings and a lot of his interactions that he has with people in the like what is now Claremont, what is now Red Hook area. And I have this line up here thinking about the information environment as sort of a baseline as to like how is information flowing during the revolution. And he says here, one knows not what to believe, so muddy and suspicious are the conduits of information. Now, I highlight this because we live today in a time of misinformation, of confusing information. Where do you get your news from? Where do you get your information from? That was very much the same during the American Revolution. There's a series of newspapers that are printing in New York. There's two prominent ones that eventually are going to come up to Poughkeepsie and Kingston. Beyond that, there's roughly 37 newspapers across the colonies. Americans are highly literate during this time. But I think that we shouldn't overemphasize literacy and reading. In many ways, this is very much a society who gathers to hear the news. They gather in places like this, like in the Elmendorf. Um, the society that exists here in Rhinebeck is in many ways what historians refer to as a face-to-face society. Sometimes that's described as like an oral culture as well. But their primary medium of communication and information is word of mouth. Now, that might be someone reading a document out loud. Thinking about that, if you go back and read the Declaration of Independence, was it meant to be read silently or was it meant to be read aloud to a crowd? So there's often particular places that are like crucial. So inns and taverns are one, churches are others, courthouses are another space where this happens. Just as important as the flow of information from newspapers was also rumor and gossip. So if we think about the spread of information, people constantly discussed actions that are happening around them. Information and misinformation was regularly transmitted from person to person, from farm to farm, from town to town at like the maximum rate of roughly 30 miles per day. That's kind of like what a horse could travel, give or take. But so it might require several visits to the inn to actually tease through and sift through the facts of what was rumor and what was reality. Now, that's especially so in rural towns. My bigger point being is that if we're trying to understand what was the revolution like at the local level, it was confusing. It was chaotic. There was a ton of misinformation floating around. Here's just one example. So a farmer from Red Hook writing in November of 1777. Now, November of 77. John Burgoyne's British army had been defeated at Saratoga the month prior in October. So they had surrendered. The threat of invasion is over. The farmer from Red Hook writes, there's a series of ships heading up the Hudson River with 20,000, guess where from? Russian soldiers sailing up the Hudson River, getting ready to invade. Where? Why, Red Hook, of course, because we all know that it is the center of the world and that's where you're going. So in thinking about that type of information is floating around with the actual like events and occurrences of real raids, of real alarms that are happening in the community, in the wider vicinity. So again, I just stress if we're trying to understand what revolution looks like locally, it's confusing. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of bad gouge, scuttlebutt that's floating around that people are having to sift through on a regular basis. All right, so the committees, how do they enforce things? So if we're thinking about experience of the revolution, one of the most common unifying experiences is going to be service in the militia. So the militia is going to be sort of taken over by the local committees. The committees, as we see here, note here that the officers are elected early on. So common people, so this is from Rhinebeck precinct, they would get together and note David Van Ness, he's a Red Hooker. So they're going to popularly elect their officers. Now, the committees are going to rely upon the militias to do a whole lot of things. And that's in particular is going to be enforcing and suppressing loyalism. They're in many ways going to be a police force during this period who's going to make the revolution happen. They will regulate society rather than being as a warfighting institution. And I highlight that thinking about, again, sort of wartime experience for those serving in the military. Serving in the military was a common experience. Fighting in battles, not so much. The most prominent common experiences are going to be military service, sure, but it's not going to be kinetic conflicts. It's going to be a host of other things. So how can we see this? Where are some great examples? If you are interested in this, Fold 3 is a website, but they're also available when the government shutdown gets over. You can access them through the National Archives, which are pension records. So in the 1830s, basically soldiers that are now older, they're in their 60s, 70s, could apply for pensions. And to get a pension, you had to explain, what did you do in the revolution? So there's a host of these, and you can sort of go through and look by locality. So Jacob Cole is one of those individuals. He's from Rhinebeck precinct, generally speaking, what is today Red Hook. If you like search through, he'll appear on like the census records from 1790, 1800. He's going to be one of these individuals who is enlisted. Now, his experience is quite common. Again, so to what are people doing during the revolution? What does militia service actually look like? It sometimes can be disappointing, but like they're not really fighting at Saratoga. Most of them are not fighting at the Battle of Yorktown. What they are doing is a host of other things. So I'm gonna use Cole as an example to sort of illuminate what are other people doing. So Cole enlists in the fall of 1775, and he enlists in what he calls as a Minuteman Company. Essentially, this would be so like out of this group, they would basically each company would have to choose like every fourth person, and they would generally do that by saying who can run the fastest, who's the youngest, who can like respond the quickest. So it really didn't have anything to do with like, are you really the best shot and the most martially like ready? It's like, no, you seem young enough and you can sprint. Okay. So he's going to serve as a Minuteman. Now, generally speaking, they could be called out at a moment's notice. They will sort of get around throughout the period. But what does he actually do during this period as a Minuteman? He says, quote, yeah, I was in readiness to turn out at a minute's warning, but I didn't do that. I was never actually called into service in 1775. I paraded once or twice a week. So what that means is they probably showed up at the Elmendorf Inn and they had some drinks. Like that's pretty much what parading would do. So that's what he's doing largely in 1775. Now, as 75 transitioned into 76, he says early in the year of 76, his company's disbanded, and then he winds up joining up in David Van Ness's company as a soldier in that. And so I have up here on the left are essentially like the red dots are the places that he's going to go. One of the common themes of being in the militia is movement, is mobility. They're moving all over the place as the war starts to take off. This idea of sort of like, defending home and hearth. Yeah, they are kind of doing that, but they're also responding across the colony. So in June of 76, he gets called out to what is now Pleasant Valley. He marches down there and he says, quote, to keep guard over the disaffected inhabitants who have been apprehended and were kept there. So loyalists, or maybe not loyalists, but individuals who refuse to sign the association, they've been imprisoned down in Pleasant Valley, and he marches down there and he's basically standing guard duty over these prisoners. He's down there for 3 days. Then he returns to Red Hook back here, and he's just here until the end of 76. All right, in 1777, January, he's going to get called out, and then he marches all the way down to Westchester County at what is today, what was Kingsbridge. Basically, it's like Yonkers-ish today, sort of where Manhattan crosses over. But before they can get there, they go to Rhinebeck Flats. That's like present-day Rhinebeck. And what happens there? There's so many disaffected people among the soldiers that he's with that they can't make it any further. So they wind up staying there for a while until they can gather some more soldiers. And then they march down to Fishkill, and then the Highlands, and then Peekskill, and then North Castle and Westchester, and they remain there for, quote, several days. They're going to be there in total, he says, for roughly a month, and then they get sent back home. So now we're like February of 77. In addition to that, he says during the spring of the year, he's serving under Captain David Van Ness. And what are they doing? They're going through Livingston Manor and they're arresting, again, the disaffected. So he's going to arrest individuals in Livingston Manor, and then they're going to march them down to what is today like Tivoli. They're going to get them on ships. They're going to cross them over to the what is Esopus, or like the kind of the Rondout area today. And they're going to imprison them in that area. Another time later in the spring, he's called out to the house of Jacob Thomas in Red Hook, and he stands guard there while they do court martials. So that's what he's doing during that period. He serves there for 1 week during the court martials. A little bit later, June of 77, he's called out again, but this time he goes north to Claverack. He's there transporting prisoners once again down to Esopus. Another time later in the year, he says that he's engaged going up to Kinderhook to do the exact same thing. Later in early 1778, he gets drafted again. He marches down to West Point. Then he serves in the Hudson Highlands. He's going to be down there for a series of months. He continues doing this for a while. He sort of goes back and forth down into the Highlands or down across from West Point. Point being is that this is his common experience, and it's the common experience for the vast majority of militiamen. They don't see kinetic action. They're not in pitched battles. They're not like carrying the flag over the hill at Saratoga. Their common experience is doing a lot of the mundane, but all of that secures their community. it suppresses loyalists. And so I have up here a lot of what they're doing is going to be suppressing loyalists. They're going to get called out on alarms occasionally, but a lot of the times they get called out on the alarms, and then they find out that the 20,000 Russian soldiers, psych, they're not actually there. So you left your bed in the middle of the night and it wasn't a good reason. They're also going to, a lot of them are going to serve on what is often referred to as fatigue duty. So there's going to be a series of forts built throughout New York. The Hudson Highlands have multiple where West Point is today. So they're going to go down there and they're going to be doing backbreaking labor. They're going to be building fortifications, building barracks, hospitals. They're going to help with building the chain that goes across the Hudson River. They'll go up to Albany. They will ride supplies. This will be an ever-present thing. So they'll be working as wagon teamsters, driving supplies for the army, because that frees up the Continental Army, who does the real fighting when they're not in garrison. But so that is, like, again, sort of the common experience. The vast majority of soldiers, and this is basically early on, it's going to be anyone who's between the ages of 16 and 60 who's serving in the militia. That's what they're going to be doing. That's the common experience of what the war looks like. And over time, it's a drain. It's a serious drain. It's exhausting. It's tiring, especially when it pulls people out during the harvest time, when it sends you off not that far away from your house, but you're away from your family, you're away from loved ones during that time. So that, in many ways, is sort of like the common experience of what serving the militia looks like in this area. Now, when they're called away, they are leaving behind homes. In many cases, we're going to see sort of like who is actually going in the militia. A lot of times it's going to be like the younger sons who get sent off to do this. So homeowners are going to face a series of tasks, both providing especially Continental Army soldiers, but also militiamen with shelter. One of the things I think that's often sort of like breezed over is every time the militia gets called out, they're not like bivouacking in a field. They're not bringing tents with them. What they're doing is staying in somebody's house or a public place like churches or inns. That's where they're going to be staying. Now, a lot of the time that's going to fall on, guess what? The residents of places like Red Hook and Rhinebeck. So early in the war, common soldiers are frequently billeted with civilians. And I'll encourage you, if you go look at our US Constitution, there's an explicit line about no quartering soldiers. So again, this is going to be highly controversial. But the option is you can either have the militia and Continental soldiers who are freezing and starving out of doors, and then they can't protect you, or worse, they'll pillage you. Or you can provide them with housing and food. So, for example, again, in October of 1777, amid the Saratoga Scare, when the British are coming up the Hudson River, the Rhinebeck Committee determines that the militia who's here, they're not enough of them. So they reach out to Connecticut and say, hey, can you send over some soldiers? And Connecticut agrees. They're like, sure, we can do that. But the question emerges as soon as they get here is, where are they staying? You ask them over here, where are you putting them up? Oh, by the way, they didn't come with food. Who's providing that? So the Rhinebeck Committee now has a problem on their hands. Who's going to cover that? They don't have just like, there's not a barracks that they can just put these people. So in 1777, you now have Connecticut soldiers, foreigners, who are being billeted upon the residents of Red Hook and Rhinebeck. They're going to stay here for a while, and it's upon the family to feed them, to provide them for them during this period. This will actually become, there will be a petition as the war goes on. The committee petitions in New York saying, hey, can you pay for this? And New York State's going to come back and respond with, we didn't authorize that. Why did you ask for Connecticut soldiers? We're not paying for that. So in many cases, who's left then to pay the bill? It's the local community. It's the local people. So yes, the soldiers are protection, but they're also a serious burden upon the local community. Now, this falls especially hard on women homeowners. 18th century gender constructions identified the home as the primary sphere of female duty. Now, there's a widespread absence of men at various points, whether that's militia duty, whether that's transporting supplies, or those killed during the war, more likely from disease. And this is especially so for women who are suspected of being loyalists or whose husbands are suspected of being loyalists. So sexual assault and rape occurred in peacetime and wartime, but records reveal that the presence of large numbers of military personnel during the revolution allowed for an unmatched level of sexual violence that ranged from coercion, manipulation, and sexual assault. Beyond the increased threat of rape and murder, soldiers, refugees, and camp followers also bred smallpox. So once again, I turn here to William Smith. So he says here, the smallpox prevails all along this side of the river and very much at Albany. And he's going to highlight a common theme. Again, this mobility, the movement. Everywhere soldiers go, everywhere the wagons go that are transporting stuff, in this case, they're bringing with them smallpox. They're bringing with them a host of other diseases into these communities. So soldiers come, they stay at your house, or they come and stay at the inn as they're passing through, and they leave you with smallpox. So again, we have an explosion of smallpox during this period, rapid rates that are sort of unprecedented. During this period, it will prompt, the need for inoculation, early form of vaccination during this period. But overall, what we see here during this period is widespread anxiety-producing, tiring, and dangerous times. And this could also lead to financial ruin for many families, especially those sort of on the edge of economic security before the war even began. And now you have one of your children who you rely upon for labor dies from smallpox. And another son is off fighting. And we get an army that comes through and eats up half of your supply that you had set aside of flour for the winter or something. So for many during the war, even though there's no battle happening here, the impact of the war is widespread. Now, beyond so those who are supporters of the war, there's also going to be numerous cases of disaffection and loyalism throughout the area that is now Rhinebeck. One of the most things missing. That's okay. So one of the key events that's going to happen is there's going to be an uprising on Livingston Manor. So that's right on the border. And one of the big fears in Rhinebeck at that time is it'll spread. Just like smallpox, the sort of disease of loyalism will spread down into Rhinebeck. And to an extent, when the soldiers get called out amid this uprising, many of the soldiers simply say, yeah, I'm not going with that. Sorry, I'm just going to stay home. I support the revolution, but not going just up north to suppress my neighbors, many of who are tenant farmers and are hard enough times as it is. So that instance is going to prompt a response. But again, fall back on William Smith in describing this, in trying to get an explanation as to why is this happening? Why are the soldiers not marching? He says that in meeting, he says an unknown traveler had just been down in Dutchess passing through Red Hook and Rhinebeck. And he says that, quote, the drafts were few and many would not serve. He says the traveler asked the reason and, quote, he replied that the people were wore out last year. Those in the army lost the opportunity of seeding their ground and were now starving for bread. So again, being away through militia service, off, doing your duty, and you weren't able to plant your crop for the year. And then soldiers from a different unit came through and ate up what reserves you had. And then the prices are going to be skyrocketing. So all of this is happening, right? Again, this sort of environment of anxiety and distress that's going on. Now, in response to things like the 1777 uprising, the committees determined that, well, we'll make people take an oath. And so if the association wasn't enough, for many, they would be forced to swear an oath. This is a public event. So thinking about where this is going to be occurring, in many cases, this would occur in front of your peers, in front of your community. It's supposed to be a peer pressure event. That's what it is designed to do. And so this oath essentially throws off your subjecthood to the crown and swears instead allegiance to the state of New York. Now, some, that's a simple thing, but others, like further north, Henry Van Schouck, is going to suffer serious mental anguish. He's opposed to what Parliament's been doing, but in his mind, he swore an oath to the king. And so what good is, if I'm now swearing another oath, are these oaths just made up fantasy now? What does that do to sort of one's place in the world? You thought that you were a British subject. That's all been ripped up and torn away. And again, sort of the mental anguish that comes along with trying to be forced to make a decision, not on your terms, but on someone else's terms, who's at your door, perhaps at 1 in the morning, and you're surrounded and dragged out of bed. And then they're going to drag you before part of your community and force you to swear this oath. If the oath wasn't enough and you still hadn't conformed and you still refused to march, the committees are gonna start taking other action as well. So that's gonna be something as simple as a fine of $30. So you'll be getting fined if you didn't turn out for malicious service, and eventually that will escalate things like removing individuals from the community, throwing them in prison, or sending them off to the enemy's lines. So if we're looking at sort of, again, thinking from the loyalist perspective, they view what's happening as like a takeover by a terrorist organization. What they are experiencing is ostracization. They're being shamed and shunned from their communities that they've lived in perhaps their entire lives, for generations even. They're facing economic isolation. People will no longer sell them goods, nor will they buy stuff from them. They're facing verbal abuse from their neighbors. They're facing often physical abuse from their neighbors and from the committee. Again, like the common sort of like trend of the committees is showing up at someone's house late at night, surrounding them, kicking in the door, and dragging people out of bed. In many cases, they'll be jailed. And like the key to this is going to be jailing them not in your own county. So rather than sending someone who gets arrested in Rhinebeck, like poor Johannes Cole over here, that's in later point, he's going to apply to the British government for basically reparations for his loyal service during the war and being kicked out of his community. But so for someone like him, or one of the others that I'll come back to later, like Mordecai Lester, he's a justice of the peace, he's outspoken, a supporter of the crown. He is going to be arrested for saying bad things about the committee. What exactly? Who was the person that heard this? Did they hear it? So he gets rounded up and he's going to get shipped off to New Hampshire. Meanwhile, guess where his family is? Right. Yeah, they're here. They're left here on their own to fend for themselves. So they're intentionally separating them and sending them off. And if one could not conform, now there's sort of a window of like, did you learn your lesson? Are you willing to say that you no longer support the king and you're a patriot? If you're unable to do that, like many were, Mordecai Lester is going to be one of those. Many of them they would force to remove to the enemy's lines. In most cases, that was New York City, what is now Manhattan, the sort of southern end of Manhattan. They would force them to move down there. Others would flee if they could up to Canada. Again, many of them will leave their wives and children behind during this period. And then the last thing that I'm going to go into a bit in just a moment is the seizure and sale of their personal property, both their like belongings as well as landed property. Okay, so the last thing I'll say about that again is thinking about for loyalism and loyalists. So in many ways, the experience of the revolution then for the loyalists is one of confusion, is one of fear, anxiety, and terror, and dislocation. Estimates are roughly 100,000 plus loyalists will depart North America, never to return. So thinking about, we sort of have a reverse refugee crisis in which loyalists flee from their homes where many of them have lived for their entire lives. All right, so what else is going on in Red Hook and Rhinebeck? Both Red Hook and Rhinebeck are going to be key to supplying the army. So Red Hook and Rhinebeck's farms were instrumental in keeping the army supplied and thereby winning independence. Like other areas in the mid-Hudson Valley, Rhinebeck precinct provided raw products, things like wheat, barley, rye, vegetables, milled flour, cattle, swine, sheep, you name it. They're going to be providing that to the army. So Hoffman's Landing, which is now Rhinecliff, sort of lower Red Hook, which is now Barrytown, and upper Red Hook, which is Tivoli at the time, Red Hook Landing. Those are three crucial areas where provisions were landed and sent to be put on small ships and brought down to Fishkill and Peekskill. They were crucial in part because the roads were so crappy, especially during sort of like your spring and fall months when you got a lot of rain. Wagons had a horrible time trying to traverse mud caked roads. And so travel by the river was crucial for getting supplies to the army. So in addition to that, the precinct's mills and barns also filled an important role for storing provisions. So we have, again, I have here is sort of just for a series of returns that are given. This is just for a month um, from Dutchess County and sort of the Hudson Valley in general. But so there we have Red Hook and Rhinebeck, what they're providing, right? They're providing hay, so it's gonna be forage for animals that you need, your draft animals for travel, as well as rye, corn, oats, wheat. So that's just like a sampling of that. We have here, this is a journal that's in the New York State Library. It's basically the ledger that is kept by one of the state agents who's going around purchasing supplies. So this one is from across the river in Ulster County, but again, it shows the same thing. So this particular person is purchasing flour and they're going from farm to farm. So you have they're purchasing agents that are showing up at your doorstep again, trying to purchase the host of resources that the army needs. So again, this system is going to rely on farmers and millers to both store stuff in their homes, and that could be have serious economic consequences. In many ways, if you're storing the army supplies, the rate is set. They can only pay a certain amount. So you're probably going to suffer a loss from trying to store private, whether it's flour or forage, and then sell that during this period. Between 1776 and 1783, the other element here is that New York maintained a permanent garrison of Continental soldiers. On average, there's roughly 11,000 Continental soldiers stationed in New York. For perspective, that's like 5% of the state's population, or like what that would equate to. So they're going to be here throughout the war. Now, exact rations are going to vary. So in 1775, the Continental Congress is going to say, like, this is what a ration should consist of. That's going to fluctuate widely based on what's available. If you've read like Joseph Plum Martin's memoir, they're always hungry. There's like never enough food ever. But so that's like what, on paper at least, the soldiers are supposed to be receiving. And for New York, that's like 11,000 mouths to feed every single day, every single week, every single month. And so surviving returns from garrisons highlight that New York is basically providing roughly 55,000 rations to sustain the garrisons every single month. Now, what does that look like? And I think this is one of the things that's like sometimes hard to sort of visualize. Now, on average, a mid-Hudson Valley farmer is producing like 102 bushels of wheat per year, 67 bushels of rye per year. They're eating through roughly 30 of those bushels, like a family of five. So like a family of five here in Red Hook or Rhinebeck is going to eat through roughly 30 bushels a year by themselves and then sell off the rest. With that in mind, a small garrison of like 200 soldiers could eat through a single family's entire surplus in roughly 3 weeks' time. And that's not accounting for like wastage, what's lost on the way, as you're transporting these goods, which is also a common trend. So for many New Yorkers, that's a frightening prospect and one that generates significant discontent. Now, rations are not the only things that soldiers need. There's numerous accounts from both Red Hook and Rhinebeck of providing a steady drain of other materials from people's houses. That's going to include things like shirts, breeches, stockings, muskets, winter coats, wood for burning, bricks for building, you name it. It's all coming from the citizens to provide for the army. Now, the bigger point here is that supplying the war was a monumental undertaking. And it was something that touched deep into society. This was, again, just like serving the militia, this was perhaps the most common experience during the war, was having these supply agents show up at your porch and purchase or take by force your stuff. So early in the war, New Yorkers readily offer, to sell their provisions. But as the war goes on and paper currency leads to inflation, New Yorkers get more and more hesitant to part with valuable goods. So the system of communal support is going to depend upon receiving something in return. Um, so in many cases, what we're going to see as the war goes on is going to be hesitancy and resistance. And that's going to lead to impressment. So impressment, this is often more associated with like the War of 1812, in which like the British are like taking sailors and forcing them on their ships. But impressment during the Revolution is a series of laws that will be passed that allow the quartermaster's department to show up to your farm and say, per the quota, I need 2 cows. You've got 2 cows. I'm taking them. Now I'm going to pay you for them, but I am taking them. Um, Beyond that, it wasn't just stuff. It could also be services. So the army often impresses people from Red Hook and Rhinebeck to do services. So yeah, I'm going to need flour and it needs to get to Fishkill. By the way, you are driving it down to Fishkill. Thanks. I'm paying you this funny money, this paper stuff that's rapidly becoming, of no value. But so that again is going to be a common experience, one of the most common experiences that's going to cause friction, conflict between local officials, these sort of state agents, and the local communities. So the local localities are again trying to sort of like figure this out as they go. All right. So beyond that, in addition to the impress, and so again, I just have here right there we go. The need to drive goods down to the southern part of the state. The army is not the only one who's consuming goods at like the rapid rate. In many ways, the revolution is a period of refugee crisis. So New York City, which is the second largest city at the start of the revolution, roughly 25-ish thousand people, is going to empty out. So when the British take it over, there's like 20,000 plus refugees just from the city alone, and then from Long Island. Dutchess County will become the most heavily sort of zone of influx of refugees during the revolution. So in addition to the army that's eating stuff, there's going to be thousands of refugees that arrive with nothing. They're going to show up into these communities, and there is no centralized state level program, right? There's no FEMA, there's no like mechanism for dealing with this crisis. Initially, the state is going to rely upon tradition, as during the colonial period. So it's going to fall upon the local communities. It's going to fall upon the town. It's going to fall upon the precinct. So the system of communal support that had existed, it was meant for dealing with like a handful of people per year. And what they're sort of find themselves having to deal with is an influx of hundreds and thousands of refugees. Now, as the war progressed, there's going to be refugees also that come from Canada. There's actually hundreds that come from Canada into Dutchess County, and there's also going to be more from the Mohawk Valley that come. So in Dutchess County, Frederick Jay, the father of John Jay, comments on this predicament. He says that there is a seriously distressing situation of the poor people sent from New York to this place. And then he goes on to say, quote, the committee is already in a considerable advance for the support of the poor, and it would not be in their power to provide for them any longer without some sort of immediate solution. The localities were largely left on their own to figure it out. They had to figure out how, not just would they provide food for them, where would you house these refugees? So in many cases, again, people are going to be having strangers coming into their houses, eating with them during this time of war. For the refugees, in many ways, the war was a period of 8 years of exhaustion, uncertainty, and hard living. They were regularly undernourished and relying upon the goodwill of others to survive. Now, amid this, right, amid all of these things that are impacting on people's lives, there's more. So by 1777, New Yorkers were widely complained of what they referred to as jockeying or monopolists who were draining the state of bread and every other article of food. So there's stockpilers that are going to be sort of trying to ramp the price of goods up and then sell it off for more than it's worth. There's others who know that, well, people in Boston are willing to pay more for this. And even though my neighbors are in desperate need of salt to preserve meat, I can get a better price for it in Boston. And so there's going to be a widespread both efforts at sort of like making money quick during the revolution, as well as efforts to try to stop that. So by 1779, for instance, Margaret Beekman Livingston in her diary writes that the people have so little bread, she thought that they were going to be on the verge of famine. Throughout the area that is Red Hook and Rhinebeck, people express serious indignation at the rising cost of living, and they attack these monopolistic practices. And to combat shortages for things like salt and to keep prices down, the state vigorously passed laws that tried to outlaw and prevent this from happening. If those things were not enough, in many cases, New Yorkers took action just by themselves. There's a series of great cases in Kingston and Poughkeepsie, for instance, of women essentially breaking into stockpiles of food and just taking out and paying what they thought it was actually worth, and then going on their way. Now, tied to this, as the war is going to go on, and if we're sort of thinking about is there some sort of like, democratization tied in this revolution? Is there some sort of like, liberty, freedoms that we're getting out of this thing? To an extent, there is, especially when it starts coming to the laws that the state's going to pass. One of the most important laws that the state's going to pass is dealing with taxation. So the laws that are going to be passed for taxation will, get this, wild idea, tax people by ability. So people will elect their assessors, and the assessors are going to go, and this is, again, a highly intimate thing. So you've got soldiers coming through your house and eating your stuff. You've got refugees coming through your house and eating your stuff. Now you've got assessors. And the assessors that are showing up, it's not like they show up to your house and like, well, what do you think you're worth? Like they kind of look at your house and like, all right, that sounds about right. No. They're coming into your house and they are going through all of your belongings. You're like, wardrobe, open that up. Let's see how many shirts you actually have. What are they made of? Are they linen? They're going to go through your every room within your house. But what this does is creates a far more equitable system of taxation, because guess who pays the most taxes? The wealthiest pay the most taxes during this system. And I highlight here that, unsurprising perhaps, this is going to piss off the wealthiest individuals. Robert Livingston is going to hate this. So if you're interested, in 1782, there's a letter by Alexander Hamilton. You can access it on founders.com online or founders.gov. And it's this like massive letter when Hamilton is just like bewailing this idea of assessing. He says here, the general principle of it is an assessment according to circumstances and ability. The ostensible reasoning for adopting this vague basis was a desire of equality. It was pretended that this could not be attained so well by any fixed tariff for taxable property, and leaving it to the discretion of persons chosen by the people themselves. Hamilton's going to go on and again just sort of like attack this. In the aftermath of the war, one of his like key goals is going to be trying to overturn this. But so the bigger point is that the state is going to respond to hardship. And what some of that is going to mean is a significant change in people's relationship with their government, people's change in relationship with each other as well in their local elected officials and beyond that. Now, beyond just taxation, if we're going back to loyalists, one of the most remarkable things, and I was driving into Red Hook. I haven't been up here in a while. And I was driving to Red Hook and I saw these signs about taking property. And I won't get into that. That's neither here nor there. But it was I kind of chuckled to myself. Because during the American Revolution, many of the states passed a series of laws that allowed them to seize property and then redistribute it. So if you're, so the key element that this is going to happen for the key segment of the population is going to be, once again, the poor loyalists. So these so-called confiscation laws effectively criminalized dissent against the American Revolution. The seizure and sale of loyalist property also raised revenue for a state hard-pressed to find money. And it redistributed property by loyalists to the rest of their communities. So again, I highlight here, poor Mordecai Lester. So Lester's property is going to be seized. This is from one of the books, the ledgers that's in the New York Public Library. There he is. His property was seized from Rhinebeck precinct and is going to be sold off to his neighbors. So New Yorkers are going to start seizing Loyalist property even before the state ratified a new constitution. New York, out of all of the 13 colonies turned states, probably has the most vigorous confiscation programs in the Revolution. In March of 1777, the provisional government created what they refer to as committees of sequestration. They seized property abandoned by loyalists, and they auctioned it off and then sent those funds to the state treasurer. Now, the state passed an even more aggressive act, which I have highlighted up here, the Act for Forfeiture, often referred to simply as the Forfeiture Act. This included a list of New Yorkers who remained loyal to Great Britain, and it provided that these, quote, offenders had therefore forfeited their right to own property and were banished from the state. The law would be, it empowered the state to seize and then sell their property. And by property, I mean everything. So in 1779, if we look at, basically they broke the state down into districts. So Dutchess County fell in the Middle District. Surviving auction lists from the Middle District show things that, once again, commissioners like rifling through people's homes, and they would hire neighbors to come on down. And it's kind of like a yard sale type thing. So we've got the commissioners who are just like grabbing everything. And so at the auctions, they're auctioning off bushels of wheat, corn, rye, barley, millstones. They're auctioning off the wheat that is still growing in the field, that hasn't even been harvested yet. They're auctioning off blankets, sleighs, yokes of oxen, sheep, pigs, looms for weaving, stockings, axes. They rip the windows and doors out of buildings and auction those off too. Now, they also offer more elegant items, things like mirrors, feather beds, mahogany desks, table linens. And what's most remarkable about this process is that the vast majority of this stuff, these material goods, get distributed out to those in the community who need support. Now, beyond personal property, the state is also going to go after landed property. So again, Mordecai Lester is one of those individuals from Rhinebeck who's going to lose his stuff at the benefit of others from the precinct who are going to become, who will gain that. So as the law stipulated, they were supposed to give priority of property to the refugees. The way they set it up was that they could lease or sell the land. So you could basically take out a mortgage with New York State for a piece of land. So for refugees, this is a godsend. As Jonathan Lawrence, a New York City refugee to Dutchess County, recounted in 1779, with the leased land, he was able to plant corn, wheat, and potatoes. And a year later, he was actually supplying the Continental Army with the goods that he grew on his leased land. Now, the law proved instrumental in propping up refugees, and it also simultaneously undermined the position of loyalists in their community. In many cases, husbands and fathers who had fled to British lines left behind their wives and children. And so now this is another predicament. In many cases, the commissioners found themselves having to evict wives and children in order to sell off the land. And unless you have a committee member or someone from the community who's willing to intervene on your behalf, the likelihood is that you're going to get evicted and sent down into New York City, where you may or may not know anyone, and probably without any of the property that was your home and your belongings. Now, it's also an opportunity for tenants who got out from overbearing landlords and had the opportunity to take out a mortgage and eventually purchase land. Now, this is far more common in southern Dutchess County, especially the area that is now Putnam County. So there's like roughly 500 or so of these seizures and sales that'll occur in Dutchess County alone. But a handful actually take place, again, up here in Rhinebeck and Red Hook. One of those in 1778, Harmon Knickerbock, he was a tenant from Rhinebeck Precinct, and the committee's going to go to bat for him. So when they're selling these things off, the committee men, right, they know their neighbors. And so he's been a longtime tenant, and he's described as, quote, warmly attached to our common cause, which he's proved by his voluntary service in the army with the militia. And so the Rhinebeck Committee is going to intervene on his behalf, and they're going to help him get a leasehold, that he'll have a mortgage from the state, and he will eventually turn it into the purchase of property. So point being is that to some extent, what we will see here is that before the revolution, there's roughly 1,800 freeholders in Dutchess County. The seizure and resale laws add another 400 freeholders just through this act. Now, the long-term effects of this are more complicated, but like the immediate impact is going to perhaps be in this sort of democratic character of, as William Smith once again is going to complain about, leveling society, of trying to create equality among the people during this period. All right, so the last thing I'll touch on. Amid revolution, I think one of the things we often sort of think about, one of the more common things is this democratization, especially of politics. And to an extent, yeah, kind of, maybe. What does happen is that office holders start to look a lot more like the people they represent. If you go through property holdings of elected officials, they will sort of drop from what would have been maybe considered like the gentry into like the middling class, or even some of the lower sorts who are going to get elected to office. So here, once again, William Smith, counting from 1778, the election that's going to be held in Rhinebeck precinct, roughly 200 people are going to show up and vote in this. So yes, voting does become a sort of key motivator here. People are going to be participating in politics more. And one of the, if the revolution doesn't bring about full democracy, it does bring about, many historians make the case, the idea of popular sovereignty. The idea that government exists by the people and for the people. That is going to become an instrumental thing, a bedrock of the American experiment. Now, who makes up the people, though? So the classic American paradox is that somehow the revolution facilitates the creation of what some will argue is the freest society in 1783 on Earth. And yet it also reinforces chattel slavery. So in May 1780, Ananias Cooper of Rhinebeck, he's a justice of the peace, he serves in the committee, he's serves in the militia. He took out an advertisement in the New York Journal. Tom, Cooper's 30-year-old enslaved servant had run away. Now, Cooper suspected that he had made his way toward the British, where he might just find freedom, or at least something close to it. The revolutionary crisis also highlights for us the hypocrisy of liberty and equality in a slave society. And Dutchess County was, in many ways, a slave society. Rhinebeck, in particular, was one of the heaviest slave-holding regions in Dutchess County. After the war, 23, actually more than 23% of households owned a slave. And in 1777, while they're trying to draft the Constitution, we think, what's the impact of the war? How does it infringe upon people's day-to-day lives? The delegates at New York's Constitutional Convention made the determination that wartime exigency made it, quote, highly inexpedient to discuss abolition. Now, simultaneously, in 1781, as the war goes on, the state is going to authorize the enlistment of Black men as soldiers who could earn their freedom through military service. One of the things that often surprises people, coming down, the Hessian soldiers. So they're actually not Hessians, they're Braunschweigers, sorry, from a different region. But when they come through after Burgoyne's army surrenders, in many of their diaries and journals, the constant remarks that they make is, wow, the American army is filled with young men, old men, and Blacks. So we get by 1777 even, into 1780, 81, 82, 83, is that the revolution locally provides opportunity. It provides, especially for white men, the ability to participate in government, the ability to have representation by individuals who look like they did. And yet simultaneously, it is going to condemn thousands of African Americans to slavery. And it won't be until a gradual bill will be passed after. And we think about that too as how impactful is the revolution for women as well and other groups. So, and again, sort of the idea of this American paradox is that locally and at the state level, and then beyond that nationally, is that the American Revolution is capable of perhaps achieving for some liberty and freedom, and not for others. That's all I got.
Percentage of millennials who have those counts?
You know, that's a good question. So historians disagree about this.
Can you repeat all the questions?
Yes, certainly. Yep. Yeah. So the question was rough percentage of loyalists in Dutchess County, and that's tough. So early on, so how do we? One of the things is like how do we determine that number? So one of the if you look at like the signers of the association, that's a good like baseline. But as the war goes on, some of the people that were pro-independence become loyalists. And a lot of others who refuse to initially assign the association will sort of become neutrals or at least say like, okay, I'm fine with just leave me alone and I'll support the war. Historically, like if you're looking back to like in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the British, or actually during the revolution, the British are going to think that the Hudson River Valley is filled with loyalists. And to an extent early on, there's perhaps some justification for that. Evidenced by what happens in Livingston Manor, evidence what happens throughout Rhinebeck, the militia refuses to march. The question again is going to be, are they really loyalists or do they just not want to go fight a revolution? Poughkeepsie, there's a great case as well that looks at that. Generally speaking, I think historians today would say roughly 20% of the population. Upper level, roughly 20% of the population. And that as the war goes on, that's going to sort of fizzle out. It's going to be a lot less than the British think that there are. And I think that there's going to be a lot of individuals who will try to sit out the revolution. There's a great article, if you're interested, by Sungbok Kim that focuses on Westchester. And he makes the case that as the war goes on, especially, there's going to become a large segment who in 1775 were perhaps supportive or like ardently resistant to it. And as the war comes through their communities and they get tired out, they're going to become disenchanted and just try to sort of like let the revolution pass them by. Yeah.
Was there, as there is today, a significant difference, so to speak, between the urban population and the rural population politically? Was that also the case during the revolution?
To an extent, yeah. So I think that. Oh, sorry. Right. Yes. The question was was there a difference sort of politically between between the urban population and the rural population? Yes and no. So I think one of the things, especially Dutchess County, they will be viewed. So New York in general is going to be viewed as sort of like laggards, like that they are not getting on board with the wider revolutionary movement. There's going to be, so if you're looking for sort of like commentary, John Adams, again, he comments on everything. He's going to say, I think that everyone in New York is either loyalists or like they just don't know what they want to do, like what side they're going to go. Much of the focus is on New York City. So early on, New York City will be sort of the leader. And you're going to have a few things. I mean, your newspapers are going to be in New York City. There's going to be your organizations. So the first committees that organize will be in New York City. New York City's committees, they're kind of getting pissed off actually with what we would consider the Hudson Valley today. In many cases, the Hudson Valley is sort of like watch and see what happens. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they're completely of a different mindset per se. They're intimately connected with New York's wider economy. Many of them have either physically, they're going back and forth between the city and the rural areas, or they're, have like frequent correspondence with what is going on in New York City. I think to an extent, New York City is going to be far more on board with taking action, taking drastic action, perhaps, whether that's going to be seizing loyalists, whether that's going to be breaking into Fort George and taking muskets, whether that's going to be doing things like that. Dutchess County, the Hudson Valley, they're going to be slower. It doesn't necessarily mean there are individuals who are of similar mindset. Egbert Benson is going to be one of them, who is of similar mindset and is corresponding frequently with Alexander McDougall, who is sort of like the leader of the Sons of Liberty in New York City. They're on the exact same page. They're going to agree quite a lot early on in 1775, 76. The challenge they're going to face is I think part of it is like literally the rural makeup and trying to get people on board to take action. There will be a sea change after Lexington and Concord, especially. But so I don't know if that answers your question in a great way, but
Just period.
yeah. I had a hand in the back first. Yeah.
I read that one of the precipitators of the revolution was that the UK, Great Britain at that point, had already put in laws to stop slavery in the UK, and it was pushing that out to the colonies. And since it was a major portion of both North and Southern economies, that's one of the reasons everybody got let's stop this. Is that true?
Yeah. So the question was, and I think that you're in 1772, there's going to be a ruling, the Somerset case, in which Britain potentially eliminates slavery. Did that have an impact on the Americans sort of joining into revolution? And that's a great question, and it's up for debate. Some historians are like adamant that yes, it did, especially for places like South Carolina. So in how this comes together. So in 1772, there's going to be the Somerset case. Lord Mansfield is going to there's an enslaved man from Jamaica who comes to Great Britain. In Great Britain, there's going to be abolitionists that basically break him away from his master. He'll get taken back, and they go to court and they say slavery only exists through statute laws. It doesn't exist in England. England is free ground. So they make the case, and basically the Lord Mansfield's ruling is, you're correct. England is free ground. Slavery only exists where there are local laws. Now, how does this connect to us? In 1766, so when you take that ruling, in 1766, the issue as Parliament views it is, Parliament says, we are the law of the land. So like the federal government today. Parliament says, when we pass a law, you can have your local laws. All the colonies can have their local laws. But if it conflicts with Parliament's law is supreme. Now, the colonies are going to say, that's cool, but you didn't grant us our charters. The king did. So we're equals with you, Parliament. Now, Parliament is going to be irritated by this. In 1766, they pass a law called the Declaratory Act. And it lays out and says, no. Parliament is supreme for the empire. If you pass a law that conflicts with Parliament's laws are supreme. Now, in 1832, 1833, guess what Britain does? They abolish slavery across the empire with that exact same principle. So slave owners are thinking about it. There are multiple slave ads taken out from Virginia and South Carolina. There's letters, for instance, from Henry Lee, who is the father of Robert E. Lee, in which he explicitly says, one of his enslaved workers ran away. He had heard about the Somerset case. So it is it has an impact. I think the question among historians is how much of an impact. Because there are other elements. Dunmore's proclamation in 1775, he will essentially offer freedom to enslaved peoples if they take up arms against their masters. That will also play a role. I think that the general consensus is that Somerset does matter, but perhaps was not like, it was one among numerous sort of preconditions that helps move things along toward independence. Yes.
I read an account in Saratoga that there was a wife and children of probably an officer, not a soldier, who came and lodged in Schuylerville to be near her husband while he was fighting at Saratoga. And she was a good diarist, so they have a lot of information based on her recordings. But aside from that, my question is was that common that wives and families came to the battles?
Yeah, great. So the question was, there's a particular account, I think you were thinking of Baroness Riedessel, who basically accompanies her husband during the Battle of Saratoga. Was that a common experience? Are women accompanying, our wives accompanying the army? Yes. So Baroness Riedessel is perhaps the most outspoken. She comes from Germany and accompanies her husband, and her diary is marvelous. Yes, there are. So the British Army is actually going to set a quota, and it's something like, don't quote me on this, it's like 15% of the soldiers are allowed to bring their wives and children, and that's just standard operating procedures. More will do that. So for instance, when the British come from Halifax to like occupy Boston, like upwards, I think it's like 40%, 50% will come with their wives and children. When the army surrenders at Saratoga, it'll be filled with camp followers. Now, they're performing, like women are performing crucial, they make the army function. There are a host of roles that women are doing, like mending uniforms, cleaning uniforms. If we're thinking about smallpox disease, cleanliness, camp cleanliness, your clean clothes, right, is going to be crucial for keeping your army fit and able to fight. So both the American Army and the British Army are going to have hundreds, pretty much with each army of camp followers. George Washington is sort of going to, complain about this, and basically everyone's like, tough luck, deal with it. There's a great, if you look, recently found the Museum of the American Revolution acquired within the past like 2-3 years. There's a really fabulous drawing of, it's the North Carolina Regiment, and it's a depiction of the unit passing through Philadelphia. And it's funny because women weren't supposed to be with the regiment, and they most certainly weren't supposed to be riding on the wagons. And guess what it depicts? Women with the unit riding on the wagons. There's another, if you go, the Library of Congress has, it's a panorama of West Point in 1781. Right in the center of that painting are women camp followers who are feeding the soldiers. So yes, it was a common experience. So yeah.
Your research obviously is about the people who were taking part in the revolution, but I'm wondering if you're aware of a lot of resources depicting the revolution through the eyes of the British who are participating specifically in battles in this part of the country.
Yeah, so the question was asking about if there are accounts and depictions from the British perspective, especially from like the soldiers who are on campaign, or
coming from Britain or England and Ireland.
Yes, there are. There's a number. One of the ones I can think off my top of my head is Sergeant Lamb. You can access it online. It's like Internet Archive. You can also they have copies of it. It's really fabulous. He is going to participate at Saratoga. He gets captured there. He's going to go down to the Southern campaign, and he'll get captured at Yorktown. But he's highly articulate. Gives a great overview of it. In addition to that, if you're interested in the sort of like Hudson Valley, John Simcoe kept a diary. So he is technically, he will be in charge of the Queen's Rangers, which are like a quasi made up of loyalists and British soldiers. They will raid up and down the Hudson Valley, especially a lot in Westchester. They'll participate sort of in the raids in 1777. So that's another great example. And then there's a host of also like junior officers who kept diaries with Burgoyne's invasion from Canada, as well as a handful that were out in the Mohawk Valley for the siege of Fort Stanwix. So yeah, so if you're interested, shoot me an email. I can drop you 5 or 6 that I know off the top of my head, but there are lots of resources that are really great in that regard.
Picture through the journals and through the letters and other resources that were not available in real time, so to speak, when all these things were going on. And I'm curious about communications because, today we have real time, immediate, whatever, from whatever perspective you can imagine. And so I'm wondering, for example, the loyalists. Okay, so I heard from you, there they were, sort of oppressed, soldiers come, whatever was going on. I mean, did people speak, how did they speak up, the common people, to express their frustration, or they just put up with it because they felt everything was going to be taken from them if they didn't, basically?
Yeah, so the question, and please correct me, the question is in asking, focusing more on loyalists in regard to
how communications were done, because you're referring to letters. Okay, people had letters, then they wrote in their journals. I don't know who was reading the journal then, probably nobody. So you're learning all this many years later, you're getting all the details, but I'm wondering what was, like, you said there was verbal communication, but the verbal communication in the churches and the taverns and that sort of thing was how people mainly communicated.
So okay, yeah. So the question is, what did communication look like? And sort of real time, was there real time communication sort of in our digital age where we all have access to a host of different sources? What did that look like during this period? Yes and no. I mean, so verbal communication is really powerful during this period, and it is pretty quick. So I mean, like, for instance, word of Lexington and Concord makes it from the events near Boston to New York City within like 2 or 3 days. So there's a delay. There's certainly a delay. But in between that, I would say like a lot of rumor and gossip is sort of filling in. And what that does in a lot of cases, especially for like the militias, like people are presented with arguably too much information. One of the challenges that Washington has early on in the New York campaign, and that goes so disastrous for him, is that he can't sift through reliable information. He has a ton of information. People are just coming to the army and they're telling him, "Oh yeah, I saw British soldiers over here." Okay, well, how many? I don't know. "Oh, I saw British soldiers over here." Like, okay, well, and so now, especially when we're thinking about like the Battle of Brooklyn now, he is sort of in like information inundation. So I think the question is, they have just as much information, even if it's not like as rapid as we think of today. But I think the amount of information was quite similar. And a similar challenge to what we face today is, how do you make sense? How do you know what is either factual? How do you know an intelligence source that is accurate and reliable? That was something that they struggle with for the entire war. Washington will try to set up sort of secret intelligence gathering through individuals that he like, no, I can totally rely upon this person. And even then, sometimes he couldn't. So a lot of times they're reacting on bad information or partial information during the period.
Yes, talking about the higher echelons of the military. What about the common people?
Right, but common people are doing that too. So for instance, like the alarms that the militia is getting called out on. Sometimes that is prompted, but again, it is common people coming with information. So they are the ones providing. Now, it's also common people, right, who are providing like the gossip to the local committee. So one of the individuals when I was working on Westchester County, John Gedney, he gets reported by I forget her name, but so there's basically the tavern owner overhears him bad mouthing the local committee. Later that night, when she closes the tavern, she goes down to the local committeeman's house and says, "Well, John Gedney said this about you." That same night, the committee gets together and they're at his door. So local people are, I mean, like common people are instrumental in this network of both sort of spreading misinformation and also providing crucial information.
Just want to get the last question, give someone a chance online to ask. Someone asked how reliable William Terry was as a narrator. given like he characterized everybody on Livingston's Manor as loyalist and Chancellor Livingston was a radical. How do you feel about the source?
Not great. Yeah, I think that one of the challenges, and I think part of historiography of revising stuff as we've moved forward, I think that there in part has been a series of trends as how do we depict tenants and the sort of relationships, and that varies over time when what is influencing individuals. I think one of the things in looking at the tenants, especially when comparing them to other tenants, I think wider study, and that's nothing, right? His focus is on a single place. I think when you provide comparison, so the tenant farmers, for instance, that are going to be on loyalist estates, they're perceived as patriots. And so what a number of other historians have said, sort of like writing in the 1980s and 1990s, was that in most cases, tenants across, and it's not just in New York, it's going to be in New Jersey, it's going to be in the Carolinas, basically tenants, generally speaking, sided with the opposite of what their landlords did. It happened to be that the Livingstons, what's his famous quote, swam with, the current essentially, and stuck with the Patriot movement. Whereas some of his counterparts from the southern part of Dutchess County, like the Phillipses or Beverly Robinson, went the other way. And so their tenants are perceived as great patriots. And so the tenants on Livingston Manor are perceived as ardent loyalists, but were they? Were they trying to avoid the war? Were they trying to, secure some sort of actual hold of land? And you think, what if the British won? What if the British get rid of Philip Livingston, and now you have tenants that are loyal to the crown who helped facilitate that? Will they, work out with actually owning the land? So that's sort of my response to that.